Hello, I'm Tom Keatinge, Director of the Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies at RUSI, where we focus on matters at the intersection of finance and security, including, of course, sanctions. To get the sanctions conversation started at your conference, I've been asked to share my thoughts on sanctions purpose versus reality. Now, if you listen to political leaders talk about foreign affairs, especially in the context of Russia's illegal war of aggression in Ukraine, you hear a lot about sanctions. But how much of that is talk and how much is reality? I could recommend which politicians and policymakers to listen to for the latter, and which you should avoid listening to unless you want to hear fantasy, but if I did that, of course, I'd lose a lot of friends. Designed properly and used well, in combination with other diplomatic tools, sanctions can support a political objective. For example, sanctions can impose arms embargoes and travel bans that can be highly effective. Sanctions can freeze assets, which, if the assets can be identified, of course, might change the decision-making of the target. Sanctions have had some success. Some argue that it was sanctions pressure that brought Iran to the table to negotiate the 2015 nuclear deal, which resulted in temporary sanctions relief. Or further back, sanctions are credited with persuading Libya to give up its nuclear ambition in 2003. But incorrectly used, poorly thought out and ineffectively implemented, sanctions are nothing more than posturing. Does anyone remember the sanctions put on Qatar by its Gulf neighbours? No? What about the decades of sanctions on Cuba? Has anything changed there? Not really. Sanctions are easier said than done. They are no light switch that you can flick for an instant impact. Now, in the case of Allied sanctions against Russia in response to its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we've seen unprecedented sanctions. Unprecedented because never before in modern history have Western allies aimed sanctions at a country that is so integrated into the global economy. The sanctions are also sweeping, as they cover financial services, individuals, specific companies and broad swathes of different trade and industrial sectors. And no doubt more targets will emerge as the months of 2023 pass by. In a series of statements, Mairead McGuinness, the DG FISMA Commissioner, has asserted that sanctions on Russia are working. Trust me. Perhaps they are, but it is incumbent on our leaders to demonstrate that impact. After all, it is certainly the case that sanctions are working on those in Europe that have seen their businesses suffer as a result of implementing sanctions. Of course, those business losses are nothing compared to the suffering of the Ukrainian people. So let's assume that sanctions could and should work. How do we ensure that this is the case and that the sanctions that are issued are as effective as possible? First, they need to be designed properly. Too often, sanctions which are, on the whole, implemented by the private sector are designed by people who have no understanding of how the implementers, the private sector, operate. Inevitably, this results in sanctions that are difficult to implement at best or at worst don't achieve their objectives. Second, once issued, the sanctions need to be implemented. This means governments have to work with their private sector to help and educate them and, if they fail, thirdly, there must be enforcement action. It's no good if the private sector does not feel genuine pressure to implement sanctions. But it may also be that governments have to incentivise compliance with sanctions. If you ran a business that suffered as a result of implementing sanctions, what would be your natural instinct? So we need to understand the challenges faced by the private sector and respond. Fourth, we need to maintain pressure. Russia has agency. It is adapting its activities in response to the sanctions. So we need to constantly monitor for change and ensure that when new operations and activities emerge that circumvent sanctions, we react to cut off that new activity immediately. And lastly, for now, we need to focus on third countries that offer circumvention opportunities for trade with Russia. Now, I noticed that sanctions envoys from the EU, US and UK are constantly flying to the UAE, to Central Asia, Turkey and other countries that have emerged as cutouts in trade with Russia. I can see the reason for this diplomatic engagement, but I would like to see more time spent with companies in our own countries that are sending these goods. If the goods don't flow, then the circumvention does not happen. That's an area to consider in my opinion, and these are all issues we address in our SIFMANET project, in which the AML Centre is an important partner and which you can read about in detail on the RUSI website. Our research programme at RUSI was founded in 2014 with the idea that better public-private partnership was what was needed to achieve a step change in the response to illicit finance and financial crime. Nowhere is such partnership more important than in the sanctions arena. Sanctions are designed by bureaucrats, but oftentimes the success of their implementation relies on the private sector. Without partnership, our sanctions will fail. We owe it to the people of Ukraine to ensure that we do everything we can to make our sanctions succeed and support their victory. Thanks for listening and enjoy the rest of the conference.